Getting my little last of my dinner.
Good for you.
Let's get going here, and so welcome everybody to the final Save Our Canyons speaker series, where we're going to talk about water, and we'll hopefully do some more of these speaker series later in the year, and maybe even in person if we can get everybody, vaccinated and stuff like that. So I know everybody's been itching to get off of Zoom and get back into a room together. So we're going to try and make that happen later this year. So tonight is a great topic. We're going to be talking about water. Last week we had an amazing session, interactive kind of writing and storytelling session, trying to create a new narrative for the Wasatch Mountains, or just explore what a narrative might be for the Wasatch Mountains. And then we talked about Alaska and Anwar and adventuring in the first speaker series this month. So great way to wrap it all up with water here locally in the Wasatch. So before I hand it over and introduce Laura Briefer and Mike Devries, I wanted to give it just Alex a few moments to talk about an opportunity to protect the Wasatch. As we were looking through some of the questions, it made my heart light shine bright to hear how many people asking, what can we do to help protect the Wasatch? So Alex is going to give you a quick to-do item.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Carl. And yeah, definitely echoing what Carl said. We're excited to be joined by Laura and Mike tonight. And so what can you all do right now? We've been working very hard. Lately, we've been working extra hard to organize around the Central Wasatch National Conservation and Recreation Area Act, which, if you recall, or if you don't, going back a handful of years through the Mountain Accord process, we've been looking at long-term land conservation for the Central Wasatch between Parley's Canyon, going south to Little Cottonwood Canyon. So that area encompasses about 80,000 acres, includes, the highest visited areas of the Central Wasatch, and is a really important focus for a lot of our work, for Save Our Canyons work. So I put in the chat, a link to maps and a petition that we have going. We've been talking to a few neighborhood and community councils per week, every week this month, as well as doing a lot of outreach into the community around businesses, and emailing all of you and our email list to try to help us and the Central Wasatch Commission better shape this National Conservation and Recreation Area Act. Right now, it's not really reflecting what we need it to be, which is protecting the headwaters of the Cottonwood Canyons and making sure that lands that have long been accessed and really our wilderness quality lands are protected as such, as well as a few other really important elements that we hope you help us by signing the petition and learning more, going to our website or to that link that I put in the chat to learn more about the Central Wasatch Conservation and Recreation Area Act, and signing that petition, and we'll be getting in touch with more information coming up in the next few weeks or month as things develop.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. And then just a quick reminder, as folks are coming in, I think you're automatically muted, but I think you'll get the best value, at least from the presentations that we're about to do. If you go up into your top right corner of your Zoom screen, you go to view and you hit speaker mode instead of gallery mode, because we will be sharing some full screen presentations, and that'll help everybody view those presentations. So with that, we're going to have two presentations, and then we'll get into some Q&A after we do those do those presentations. So we're going to start things off with Laura Briefer. And so Laura probably needs not a whole lot of introduction to all of the folks here, but she is the director of Salt Lake City's Department of Public Utilities, and she's been in that role since 2016. But she's been with Salt Lake City Public Utilities for about 13 years. She's passionate about public service, sustainability, science, and public health. She comes from a close-knit family with a strong commitment to public service. And Laura has also co-authored 2 papers focused on water resources and watershed management of the Central Wasatch Mountains. These include one study regarding climate change impacts on water supplies and the Central Wasatch Mountains watersheds, published in the Journal of Earth Interactions, and an article regarding Salt Lake City's watershed management, published in the Journal of Ecosystem Services. In addition to her professional work, she lives in Salt Lake with her husband and 2 kids. She's an avid outdoors person. She's great at setting a breakneck pace, trail running, and carrying a great conversation all along the way. She's loves to also hike, mountain bike, and ski through Utah's backcountry areas. She also serves on a number of boards in our community related to water, like the Provo River Water Users Association, the Utah Lake Water Users Association, and Carpe Diem West, which is focused on water and climate change issues in the Western United States. And with that said, we are very lucky to have her knowledge, her expertise, and her passion with us tonight. So give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up her presentation, and then when that concludes, I'll introduce Mike Devries with the Metropolitan Water District of Salt Lake and Sandy.
Carl, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I hear, yes.
All right. I would like to add that before Laura was with Salt Lake City, she was executive director of Friends of Alta.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mimi. And I worked very closely with Mimi in that role too. It's great to see you.
All right. Well, Laura, the floor is yours. I hope you can see that.
I can. And thank you, Carl. Carl and I have been working together on a lot of Wasatch issues for many years now. So it is a pleasure for me to be here with him and with Save Our Canyons and all the folks that have joined. I think Carl and I, wow, we worked very closely on Mountain Accord and those processes, and spent a lot of time and effort on those, trying to get to the bottom of what we wanted to protect these watersheds. So Carl does a great job, and it's great to be here. This presentation is one that I started actually a couple of years ago when I did a keynote at Utah State University regarding Restoring the West was the title of that presentation. And sort of what flowed from that is just a recognition that there is a real rich story to the Wasatch and their role with respect to water supply. There is a very rich past. Of course, there are a lot of things happening in the present, and more to come in the future that we're constantly watching. And so I thought I kind of try to tell that story. I won't be too long at it because I know we want to have some conversation, but I think it's an important story. And before I move into that too, I also wanted to just thank Mike Devries for coming to help present with respect to Water is Life tonight. Mike is the general manager of Metropolitan Water District of Salt Lake and Sandy, and a wonderful partner in terms of managing our water resources collaboratively. And we work very closely together. And I know Carl will do a much better introduction, but Mike is a great friend and a great general manager. So it's great to see him here too. And I'm having Carl share my presentation because I'm on vacation in Montana right now, and my internet speed is not reliable enough for me to want to share a presentation. So Carl, could you please switch to the next slide? Thank you. So between the Metropolitan Water District of Salt Lake and Sandy and Salt Lake City Public Utility, in combination, we are drinking water providers to more than 450,000 people along the Wasatch Front. That includes all of Salt Lake City, all of Sandy City, and then a number of communities along the east bench of Salt Lake County, the current cities of Mill Creek, Holiday, Cottonwood Heights, and then little portions of a few other communities as well. And we really feel that our job, our number one job, is to protect public health by keeping water free from pollution and safe. Between our two organizations, we own and operate 5 water treatment plants and have a lot of infrastructure, thousands of miles of water lines and reservoirs and pump stations and you name it, we have a lot of infrastructure that goes into the system. But really importantly, we actively manage the Wasatch headwaters to prevent pollution in the sources of drinking water. Next slide, please, Carl. So just by looking at this picture of downtown Salt Lake City, you can really see why this city in a desert is able to thrive. I mean, just look at that forested Wasatch Mountain range that captures the storms that come in from the west, creating a water supply reservoir of snow for us. That snow runs off the mountains in the spring and the summer, providing the water that sustains the health and prosperity of our city. And Salt Lake City and the Wasatch Front are not the only communities that rely on national forests and systems like these. Forest Service lands are located in source areas for many important rivers, as well as local and regional aquifer systems. They are the largest source of municipal water supply in the nation, serving over 66 million people in about 3,400 communities in 33 states. So National Forest System lands, and I know we have our district ranger for the Salt Lake Ranger District here today too, Becky Hotsey. But this is one mountain range similar to others within our nation that are very, very important to communities for their water supply. And also even major US cities that seem distant from forests actually rely from US Forest Service lands. For example, Los Angeles, Portland, Denver, and Atlanta receive a significant portion of their water supply from national forests. And for Salt Lake City, about 90% of the water we rely on emanates from US Forest Service lands, and that's our local Wasatch Mountains, but also the Provo system that we rely upon too through Deer Creek Reservoir. Next slide, please, Carl. So Salt Lake City's primary watersheds, the map here shows sort of an aerial view with City Creek Canyon watershed to the north and Little Cottonwood Canyon to the south. And you can see the Salt Lake Valley to the east or to the west there. Our watersheds comprise about 190 square miles in area. Their elevations range from 5,000 to 11,500 feet, very close to our urban core. With respect to Salt Lake City system, they comprise nearly 60% of our water supply on average. The recreation visitation to these areas, I think, has been calculated greater than Yellowstone National Park. It's very, very loved by our community and visitors. We've got, our 4 major ski resorts within this area, hundreds of miles of hiking trails, and just, it's an amazing place. That's why I moved here too. It's an amazing place. Another characteristic of these watersheds is that they're managed by multiple jurisdictions. It's not just Salt Lake City and the Forest Service, but there are also state agencies and and Salt Lake County, and others that are involved in managing these areas for various purposes. Another interesting fact for us, it speaks to the hydrology of the area. It takes less than 24 hours for a drop of water at the top of our watershed to reach a faucet in some cases. So it's a pretty fast moving system. And I think we can go to the next slide actually, Carl. Thank you. So the past connections to our watersheds, what was that like? And this photo kind of gives a clue. Looks like an old mining community up in our watersheds. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So the Wasatch watersheds were really the foundation of the water supply for the Wasatch Front. These watersheds were the first sources of water to be developed to serve the needs of the Salt Lake Valley and Salt Lake City especially. Water development was in response to rapid population growth in the settlements of the Salt Lake Valley and during major drought periods between 1890 and 1930 to 1934. As early as 1888, Salt Lake City entered into a number of exchange agreements with farmers to acquire the rights to the Wasatch streams, and in exchange provided Utah Lake water for their irrigation needs through a canal built at the time. That's the Jordan and Salt Lake Canal. The Utah Lake exchanges allowed Salt Lake City to use the high quality gravity fed sources of the Wasatch Mountain streams for its growing population. And ditches were constructed to transport that Utah Lake water to agricultural uses. And many of these original exchanges actually remain today and are relied upon today. I think it's interesting to note that the long range plan prepared in 1929 shows every major water development project that has been constructed from Weber County and Echo Reservoir to Utah County. The 1929 planning effort was conducted at the time to meet future water needs of an anticipated population of 400,000 people, which is approximately the population that we serve today. So the past was very important in terms of setting the stage to the water supplies that we rely upon today. Long-term planning is very important for water resources. It's also interesting to note that treatment plant construction in the 1950s was the result of typhoid outbreaks and interstate commerce requirements. There is a significant link between water quality and the economic viability of the state of Utah. Both of these notes give a sense of the incredible importance of the work done over the last 150 years to ensure that our water supplies could support the growth, health, and economy of the Salt Lake Valley. Without the foundation of development of reliable, clean water supplies from the Wasatch watersheds, the Salt Lake Valley would not have had that foundation for growth. Next slide, please. So City Creek Canyon is an example of a rehabilitated watershed. City Creek Canyon collects water from about 19.2 square miles of watershed that feeds the 14.5-mile long City Creek stream. City Creek was the first water source used by Mormon pioneers settling the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. In fact, interesting, we're in the process of a water right adjudication that the state has initiated. And we found one of our first diligence claims, or actually it might be the first diligence claim in the state for that water right, dated July 23rd, 1847. So couple days before Pioneer Day. In the early years, water flowed through ditches for irrigating gardens from City Creek. Residents actually hand dipped water for their culinary and domestic needs. In 1866, City Creek was first diverted into a municipally owned piped water distribution system to provide fire protection and culinary water supply to all city residents. On June 24th in 1873, the Salt Lake City mayor and council reported that they had been informed of plans to conduct extensive mining and to build a new city at the headwaters of City Creek Canyon. The decision that these city's officials made on that day was one of the first in what would become a long history of refusals to allow unsustainable development in the watersheds. One city councilman at the time stated that if a town should be built, its natural tendency would be to foul the waters leading into the city, on which inhabitants of the city are dependent for domestic purposes. The mayor then declared that an order should be passed by this council prohibiting the filthing of those waters. The rules and regulations for quarantine purposes should protect the citizens against the waters being made impure. That was in 1873. Chlorine was added to City Creek water in 1917 to inactivate waterborne pathogens in the public drinking water supply. But then later, excessive and careless recreational use during the early 1900s resulted in a noticeable pollution of City Creek Canyon drinking water supply, and the canyon was closed to public use from 1952 to 1966 in order for it to restore itself. In 1953, City Creek became the site for Utah's first municipally owned water treatment plant as well. Next slide, please. There was also rehabilitation in the Cottonwood canyons in the past. Big and Little Cottonwood canyons experienced logging and mining in the mid-1800s. As a result, water resources were subject to pollution. In the early 1900s, incidents of runoff flu, where people would become sick from drinking the water, were reported. In 1906, the federal government reserved expanses of land throughout the country, including the Wasatch Mountains. The Wasatch Cache National Forest was established under the newly created U.S. Forest Service. Gifford Pinchot, President Theodore Roosevelt's first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, was reported to have traveled to Salt Lake City on at least 2 occasions in the first decade of the 20th century to speak to city leaders about the importance of protecting the city's watershed and begin watershed restoration activities in the areas of the Cottonwood Canyon watersheds that had been impacted by mining and logging. Salt Lake City and the U.S. Forest Service partnered in both the rehabilitation and management of the landscape, beginning at the time when the National Forest was established. Then in 1914 and in 1934, federal legislation was enacted by Congress that directs the Forest Service to further, so there's my dog, that directs the Forest Service to further protect the Wasatch watersheds in partnership with Salt Lake City. This resulted in the protection of areas that contained unpatented mining claims and provided the legislative underpinnings to subsequent forest management plans. And again, treatment plants were also constructed for these water sources in the 50s to further protect public health. Next slide. All right, so now we're in the present. And can you do the next slide, please? And that's a beautiful photo of the Wasatch there. So next slide, please, Carl. Okay, so present day safe drinking water requirements really do align well with the concept that we can manage the land to protect drinking water supplies. The Federal Safe Drinking Water Act in 1974 and then last amended in 1996 actually provides for a multi-barrier approach in order to make sure that the water that comes out of people's taps is safe. And that first barrier to pollution is source water protection. And in fact, Salt Lake City is required to submit source water protection reports to the State Division of Drinking Water. That's the entity that regulates us under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the state's equivalent. We're required to provide source water protection reports periodically for both surface water and our groundwater sources. The next step in that multi-barrier approach for pollution prevention is, of course, the treatment process. And then there's the distribution process. So as it travels through pipelines and reservoirs. And then there's ongoing monitoring of water quality throughout the entire system. It's very important that all of these things are in place. If we have failure at any part of this system, it could cause drinking water quality issues. And for instance, you could not only rely on treatment with respect to your water supplies. It's really important that the water that goes into the treatment plant is also as of high quality as it can be. I would also say that under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, we have to manage for more than 90 contaminants that are regulated under federal and state safe drinking water laws. We have a lot of accountability for that, and every 6 years, EPA, the federal EPA, goes through another review of potential contaminants that would be regulated as well. So it's definitely an ongoing federal, state, and local partnership. Next slide, please. So Salt Lake City developed its first formal watershed management plan in 1989, and that management plan continues to be updated. We updated it in 1999, and then in 2008 and 2014. Those later updates were part of our regulatory requirements as well to submit to Division of Drinking Water at DEQ. We're also in the process of doing a much broader update to it, and you'll see some more about that this coming summer. There will be a public process for that update. One of the things that we're including in our updated watershed management plan is a fire vulnerability analysis to our watersheds, as well as some additional recreation vulnerability analyses. Our last plan, our 1999 plan, was developed at the same time as the Forest Service management plan, as well as Salt Lake County's previous land use master plan. So there was great alignment between many of the jurisdictions that work together managing this area. Our plan contains 5 different elements, and that is land conservation and stewardship, partnerships. We do a lot of public education. Keep It Pure is part of our public education program. We're actually rebranding that program this year as well. And then, of course, regulation. So we regulate some activities in our watersheds and ongoing monitoring. A note with respect to land conservation and stewardship. Over the years, the city has protected more than 30,000 acres of land in these watersheds, and those are for permanent preservation to protect water quality and water resources. Next slide, please. All right, the future. I included this picture on this slide. This was from 2019. We had a very severe rainstorm that came and hit the middle of Little Cottonwood Canyon. It was quite an intense storm. It brought down a lot of debris. You can see that's me standing there in front of a pile of debris, and Mike could talk about plant diversion for quite some time. But yeah, I put this slide in here because I think storm intensification is one of the issues we're facing in the future as part of a number of climate vulnerability issues. But that was just quite an intense event, and I had never seen that much material come off the mountain during a rain event like that. Next slide, please. So what are our changing conditions for the future? Climate change, of course. We've got population growth in the areas that we're serving. We have increased recreation and development within these watersheds. And of course, all of these conditions tend to foster some conflict over land use, decision-making, access to water. Some of the challenges some of you may have heard of with respect to, I think it was 2018 in the legislature, an effort to remove Salt Lake City's jurisdiction to protect these watersheds, I think is maybe an example of that conflict. All of these changing conditions require a real collaborative generational planning effort in order to adapt to them and stay resilient. Next slide, please. So one example of a collaborative generational planning effort, and we're continuing to see how this evolves, is Mountain Accord. That process started in 2012 and was signed in 2015. Out of Mountain Accord was the creation of the Central Wasatch Commission. There was also the Central Wasatch National Conservation and Recreation Area Act that Carl mentioned earlier. The creation of an environmental dashboard, and then initiatives with respect to recreation and transportation management and solutions. I think many of you are probably involved in some of these efforts even today that are occurring through the Central Wasatch Commission Mountain Accord effort. And I'm still working very hard as we try to see the vision of that. Very much in favor of us passing these. That gives us a lot of certainty for the future concept. And then with respect to managing recreation use and transportation, I think that, you know, there are a lot of ongoing conversations about that, including UDOT's Little Cottonwood EIS and Central Wasatch Commission's Mountain Transportation Study. So a lot going on still on these collaborative efforts. With respect to planning for the future, moving a little bit away from these collaborative efforts, Salt Lake City has also conducted quite a bit of planning. Water supply and demand plan, out to have developed some climate vulnerability analysis and climate mitigation strategies. And then, of course, as I mentioned, an update of our watershed management plan. Next slide, please. So we talked about the past and the present and what's happening in the future with these incredible watersheds. And I think I hope that there are some key points that I've been able to articulate. First, the past, present, and future of the Wasatch can be an example of such a profound connection between how we manage our land and how we manage our water in the West, and the ongoing health of our communities. Second, we have lived and learned the relationship between managing these watersheds and our water resources. Investment in restoration of our watersheds, investment in proactive management of the land over the last century has resulted in clean and reliable drinking water for the Salt Lake Valley. Of course, conditions are changing and we will need to adapt our management strategies as we go along. But just as we benefit from the work and stewardship of those that came before us, future generations will live with the legacy we leave them. I hope the future generations will benefit from our good work as well. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Sorry, I'm trying to find all my buttons here and get back into Zoom. Or here we go. Bam, back. Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. And looks like there's some activity in the chat, and we'll get to some of this stuff a little bit later. But right now, I wanted to introduce really quick. Oh, there, I've lost my note. Mike Devries with the Metropolitan Water District of Salt Lake and Sandy. As Laura mentioned, he's one of many partners that she and Salt Lake City has in managing some of our water supplies here in the Salt Lake Valley. So Mike is currently serving as the general manager of the Metropolitan Water District of Salt Lake and Sandy. He has over 20 years of drinking water supply, treatment, and distribution experience. You're noticing a relationship between some of the terms that Laura mentioned and some of Mike's expertise, which is really cool. He has a background in chemistry, engineering, drinking water treatment technology, computer science, and has helped the district complete key capital improvements, including a new water treatment plant, a new large diameter water conveyance pipeline, and a pump station, upgrades to an existing water treatment plant, and replacement of over a 40 million gallon drinking water reservoir. Having spent the majority of his career in the public sector, he enjoys serving the public through the provision of reliable, safe drinking water. Mike also enjoys a variety of outdoor activities, which I imagine why he's in Salt Lake with his wife and his 3 children. He especially enjoys hiking and backpacking in the wilderness areas of Utah's mountains, and no one could fault him for that. So thanks so much, Mike, for being here with us. And when you're ready, take it away with the screen share. And thanks again.
Thanks, Carl. It looks like I cannot share my screen. Can you enable that for me?
Yep.
Excellent.
Great. Does that work?
Yes, that works. So thank you for this opportunity, Carl, and save our canyons, save all of our canyons. Appreciate what this organization does and the efforts and the emphasis on such an important focus. So, and appreciate Laura's comments. What a stellar presentation. Not much that I can add to that. I really appreciate the partnership we have with Salt Lake City as well. Laura is an outstanding leader in the water community, and just really appreciate what she does. Excuse me. All right, so I'm going to be brief. I'm just going to share maybe a little bit of perspective as to who the Metropolitan Water District is, why we were organized and established, and then a little bit of background as to our interest in the watersheds, which are very similar, of course, very consistent with Salt Lake City's. Let me go to slide or presentation mode here. Hopefully everybody can see that. So established in 1935, the Water District, Metropolitan Water District of Salt Lake and Sandy, was established on the heels of the drought, some severe drought years that Laura has highlighted. Interesting to note, this article that's attached here kind of talks about the importance of establishing additional water supplies to take care of supplementing some of the Wasatch supplies that have historically come from the creeks here. And so the intent of the organization of the Metro Water District was to be a local sponsor for supplies from the Deer Creek Reservoir, and specifically for the Provo River Project, the Salt Lake Aqueduct component of the Provo River Project. And I'll talk about the Salt Lake Aqueduct here in just a minute. The district is governed by 7 board members, 5 appointed by Salt Lake City and 2 appointed by Sandy City. Our facilities include, and I'll kind of highlight the ones that are pictured here, but upper left-hand corner is our Little Cottonwood Water Treatment Plant. And that plant was constructed in 1960, has a 150 million gallon per day capacity, is located just below the mouth of Little Cottonwood Canyon, and is really an important workhorse for the Metropolitan Water District as far as providing supplies to its member cities. Maybe one other note that I forgot to mention on the prior slide. So Salt Lake City was the original member city of our district, Sandy City later annexed into our district in 1990. So anyway, one thing to note is, so this plant, the Little Cottonwood Water Treatment Plant, was constructed, as Laura noted, prior to the 1974 Safe Drinking Water Act. Interesting side note is water was conveyed through the Solic Aqueduct, which I'll highlight here in just a second. But the Solic Aqueduct, actually, I'll jump right in and share what that is right now. But Solic Aqueduct conveys water from Deer Creek Reservoir to the Solic Valley, basically to the Little Cottonwood Water Treatment Plant, and then from there, treated water onto the 3300 South, I-215 East reservoirs that supply Salt Lake City's various distribution systems. Anyway, interesting note is when Little Cottonwood Water Treatment Plant was constructed, that was, I guess, about 10 years after water had already been distributed through Salt Lake Aqueduct from Deer Creek for about 9 or 10 years without treatment into Salt Lake City's system. Well, I guess a clarification, the treatment was some chlorination, and that was it. And so it was an important step to get this treatment plant in place to improve treatment as far as the water supplies into Salt Lake City. And also this made available the possibility of treating water from Little Cottonwood Creek, which also was prior to this time directly delivered to Salt Lake City. The other two pictures, upper right-hand corner, is our other water treatment plant that we own outright. It is a 70 million gallon per day water treatment plant, and was constructed in 2007. So it's another important facility. And then lower right-hand corner is our Point of the Mountain Aqueduct, which interconnects the two water treatment plants, the Point of the Mountain Water Treatment Plant and Little Cottonwood Water Treatment Plant. Point of the Mountain, by the way, is located in Draper. So anyway, just some of the key facilities that are part of how we supply water to our member cities. And then just noted here, part of the responsibility we have as a district is providing long-term supplies, as I noted earlier, for our member cities. In particular, in addition to those long-term supplies, the ability to treat and deliver that water as far as the source water, we have the ability to treat about 271 million gallons per day total capacity of our water treatment plants. We have roughly, we supply roughly 50% of Salt Lake City's drinking water supply, as noted here, and anywhere from 75 to 100% of Sandy City's drinking water supply. So anyway, and as Laura has already noted, we serve a population of over 450,000 people here in the Valley. I think one important note, and maybe I'll bring it up here when we get in, well, yeah, I'll bring that up here in just a minute, relating to Little Cottonwood Creek, but talking about water quality. So obviously, as Laura has already mentioned, it's really important that we as a district and other water purveyors, water providers, meet the water quality requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So there are regulatory requirements that are both federal and state. And most of what is at the state level is promulgated by the EPA, of course. But it all comes back to this multiple barrier approach that Laura highlighted as well. And one of those really key elements of that multiple barrier approach is source water protection. If source water protection is not managed appropriately, then there is a direct impact to our ability to treat and convey water effectively and meet the Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. Additionally, without source water protection, we have situations where we would have to potentially invest significant capital expenditures to have the capability to treat contaminants that would normally not be a problem as far as what's a part of the water that's supplied to our facilities. So one of the important capabilities that we have as a district is we do have flexibility with some of our source waters. I have shown here some pictures. Upper left-hand corner is Little Cottonwood Creek. Upper right-hand corner is Deer Creek. Lower left-hand corner, Jordanelle. Lower right-hand corner is Upper Bell Canyon Reservoir. So But the challenge we have, though, is there are, as everyone understands, with climate change, we have challenges with some of our supplies at different times. Sometimes there are limitations as to what is available to us as far as what we can treat and deliver to our member cities. So it's very important that we're maintaining and protecting the source water elements of all of these supplies. So this is an interesting map here. This shows, you can see highlighted different watershed areas that relate to the different source waters for our water district. So again, you can see the different sources listed here, but it's really important to note that the Wasatch Front is very critical to both the Metropolitan Water District and Salt Lake City, as has been noted. But there are also other watershed elements that we track very closely with our involvement in the Provo River Watershed Council in the upper Uinta supplies that come into the Provo River system. So specific to Little Cottonwood Creek, as Laura has already described, very interesting topography of relating to the canyons, specific to this canyon, Little Cottonwood Canyon, anywhere from 5,200 feet in elevation to 11,200 feet in elevation, but 12 miles in length approximately for the stream channel, which basically, as Laura noted, means that if contaminants are introduced into this creek, it is a very short span of time for those contaminants to make their way into the creek and subsequently into our water treatment facility, specifically the Little Cottonwood Water Treatment Plant. And so the concern there is some of these contaminants could be introduced, and in a matter of hours, we could already be, treating it in our facility here. So it's a big concern to make sure that water quality and the watershed is protected in these canyons. Some of the concerns that we have relative to contaminant risks and also future usage that can result in contamination and other risks are kind of listed here. So obviously petroleum related contaminations with various accidents or other incidents that can translate to hydrocarbons or other types of contaminations getting into the water. Of course, the big issue right now is consideration for development up the canyon specific to transportation ideas and options. There are also historic mine tunnel drainage, water quality concerns that are managed effectively right now, but we continue to watch those closely. And then lastly, as I've noted here, road salts and other potential contaminants are of concern to us as well. We have chloride levels get to certain points. There is the possibility of chloride to sulfate mass ratio impacts that can relate or can result in corrosion related concerns and risks. And so chlorides are a concern, and it's interesting to note that we have observed, as we have monitored water quality closely in the source water coming in from Little Cottonwood Creek, seasonal increases in chloride levels relating most likely to road salts. And so as we consider various transportation options up the canyon, it's very important to realize that there are a lot of water quality implications that really need to be considered. Laura already did an excellent job highlighting the importance of partnerships and the fact that this is really a multi-entity, multi-jurisdictional effort as far as watershed protection and source water protection efforts. Many agencies have roles in this. It's important relative to data sharing, research, funding. The public outreach and education is essential. And again, hats off to Save Our Canyons and what you do in helping educate the public as to some of these concerns and why it's important to manage and protect these canyons. With that is just my brief presentation, but I think we're ready to move into Q&A unless there are any questions.
Raise a question.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, Roxanne, go for it.
Yeah, I didn't know if there was like a little, some of them have a little hand you could push. You mentioned that some of the building took place during a drought, I don't know, in the 1935. Could you talk about how bad that is and how bad the outlook is that we face going forward?
Sure.
Like, are we about to get worse than that? See what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So specific to the drought that I was alluding to, so this is back in the early 30s, so about 1930 through about 1934, kind of in the Great Depression timeframe. There was a significant drought, as many of you may be aware, and that drought resulted in all sorts of economic and a variety of concerns and challenges. And it also resulted in serious shortages and supply concerns for the Salt Lake Valley. Specifically, Salt Lake City started looking for other options, and they considered a bunch of different options. Ultimately, the one that made the most sense was this reclamation project that I was talking about, with the Deer Creek Dam being constructed, as well as the Salt Lake Aqueduct from Deer Creek Dam into the Salt Lake Valley. Now, as far as the outlook, I wouldn't say that we're necessarily looking at a drought that's as severe as the 1930 through 1934 era, but it is not very positive right now, and we have been seeing trends and more consistent dry years in the recent past, probably the recent decade, especially recent decade and a half. And so it is really important that we continue to as we're looking at water supply and demand, and by the way, Metropolitan Water District, in concert with Salt Lake City, recently completed an updated supply and demand study. But I think one of the things that's really important in that is making sure that we assess and keep in mind the whole element of climate change, because it is a huge component of the whole supply picture and what realistically is available to us. But so to your question, as far as our projections and our updated supply and demand study, if we meet certain conservation criteria, and this is consistent with regional conservation goals that were established by the Division of Water Resources in 2019, I believe. If those goals are met, then we project that we will have sufficient supplies, given our current portfolio, to take care of Salt Lake City's and Sandy City's needs through 2060 is what we're projecting right now. But we do have to be very careful, and conservation is key in all of this.
Okay, thanks.
Did you have anything to add there, Laura, or?
I think Mike said it really well. We did include in our most recent water supply and demand study, we look at both supply and demand during dry years, like the historic dry years, and then we do include a factor for climate change as well. And the factor for climate change includes both decreasing supply or changes in supply, but also potentially increasing demand, because if it gets warmer, we may anticipate increased demand as well due to climate change.
But it looks good through 2060.
It looks good with more conservation. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We've amended our water conservation goals and increased those goals. And I think Salt Lake City's goals are now even a bit more aggressive than the state's regional conservation goals that Mike just talked about as well.
With respect to climate change, the predictions are that we're going to have less water, but even worse, it will be more in the form of rain and less in the form of snow. What are the plans to handle that contingency?
Yeah, do you want me to take the first stab at that, Laura?
Sure, go ahead.
So I think that's a great question, and that is part of what we had to look at with our updated supply and demand study, is our factors exactly along those lines, because you're absolutely correct. That is part of what is projected. And so one of the ideas that we're looking at as a water district, in concert again with our member cities, is an aquifer storage and recovery program to take what is available during the seasons. For example, if we're going to get more water in the way of rain as opposed to snow, the opportunity to utilize that water we may not be able to effectively use it, depending on the time of the year and demands, as we would normally be able to use it. And so one of the ideas is to take the extra available water and inject it into the aquifer and have that become an extra storage reservoir, if you will, that becomes a resource, in addition to the surface water storage reservoirs that were alluded to in my presentation, both Deer Creek and Jordanelle.
What kind of losses do you suffer? Certainly you're not going to get it all out if you inject it into the aquifer.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So I don't know that we have all of that figured out as far as the specifics. The analysis is still being evaluated as far as, so at two levels, there's a water rights component that has to be figured out with the state engineer's office and what they will allow for us to take out of the aquifer based on what we inject. And to your point, how much, what is the efficiency? And yes, there is a loss involved, and I don't have that exact number available at this point.
Great. I had a question here queued up from Will Peterson as well. Will?
Yeah, thanks. I guess a question would be, I've always been impressed by Salt Lake's leadership, Laura, to implement measures that both promote watershed protection and the water quality in the watershed. It seems like there is continued increase in users, primarily recreational, that are looking to get into the watershed. I feel like that's been amplified in the pandemic. I guess to me, there seems to be this challenge of the mental health benefits, as well as other benefits of folks getting into the watershed. How do we walk that balance between creating it accessibility to wider number of users, while also the key priority of protecting the watershed and promoting water quality?
I will take that one, and Mike, feel free to add anything. So that's been a big concern for Salt Lake City, as we've seen just the numbers balloon, especially this year during the pandemic, as you mentioned. We've seen a lot of use in our watersheds, and we've had to really adaptively manage those. Some of the concerns we have are sanitation and adequate sanitation facilities, because sanitation is a risk to water quality, improper sanitation. And then there's just folks who may not realize the rules. We've definitely had a lot more folks that we've noticed with dogs in the watershed, and I think there's a combination of strategies at play here. One is increased public education, which is something that we are rolling out in the next couple of months. And then another, and part of that education is to really help people understand the rules, not only the rules, but why they're important. And then the other piece is just management. And we've been working really hard on the management issue, and with respect to the Forest Service and some of the restroom facilities. We do a lot with invasive species and weeds and all of these impacts that we see from increased use. So I think there's still an ongoing conversation about what is the capacity of these watersheds. The capacity isn't limitless. It's not limitless in terms of infrastructure. It's not limitless in terms of just the use at every trailhead. The water resources aren't limitless. So there is a capacity there. It's a very difficult quantification to make because there's so many perspectives, but I think we really need to continue monitoring. Monitoring is a big effort as well in all of this. So continuing to monitor impacts as we go along, and the environmental dashboard and some of the other work that's happening in terms of monitoring impacts is also going to be very helpful for us.
And Laura, you may have alluded to this, but the visitor study that is being pursued as well, I think visitor capacity study is going to be an important piece of information, because it is not a limitless number as far as how many people can really, the canyons can handle. So.
Laura, you had there was a question in our forum as well. You had mentioned dogs going up into the canyon, and it's always it seems to be a constant educational piece. Could you speak a little bit to the impacts and implications of dogs? And we all love our dogs, but
yeah, we do. And you know, the impacts really have a lot to do with dog feces, and you know, I sometimes use Mill Creek as an example, where you've got a lot of dogs in that canyon, and a lot of dog poop on the trail that doesn't get picked up, and there are there's pollution impacts from that. There are pathogens and bacteria that could get into that do get into the water supply, and some of them are very difficult to treat. And so, you know, what we would want to do is make sure that we don't have that risk. The other problem with the dog issue is just the amount of use too. You know, we live at the doorstep of 1.2 million person population, and a lot of us have dogs, and it's just it's a lot, would be a lot of use to have that happen there.
awesome. Thanks.
Just a magnitude.
Thanks for
And
that.
I would add that, you know, Laura mentioned the bacteria. There have definitely been studies that quantify what Laura's referring to. So coliform bacteria, E. coli, and there's some other pathogens that definitely increase in number with a higher utilization or a higher activity of dogs in the canyon. So.
Great. Thanks for those data points too. Lindy McElwain.
What do you plan to do about population? We have these huge apartment buildings getting thrown up everywhere. Sugar House has been transformed in like 5 years, and they're downtown. They're, you know, so and I don't think it's all about affordable housing at all, but you see the same kind of thing happening north, going out towards Antelope Island, just track houses. I mean, there never used to be a town of Eagle Mountain. You know, at some point, and the same thing is happening in Park City. And, you know, where our water supply is not limitless. So how do you deal with that? You know, I mean, it's like, is it all about private property? And if the developer owns the land, they can do whatever they want?
Yeah. So this is a really important question, and it's actually one that we've been studying since the 2020 or 2019 legislative session, and this has to do with a water body kind of at the downstream end of our greater watershed here, Great Salt Lake. And Great Salt Lake levels have been shown to be shrinking, and there's a lot of concern about the impacts and environmental and public health impacts of a shrinking Great Salt Lake. Representative Hawks in our state legislature started a process to look at some of the causes and effects of a shrinking Great Salt Lake. And I'm talking about Great Salt Lake, but I think this is transferable to all parts of your question, because the real link here is the coordination between the water suppliers and the land use planners, and, you know, those that are doing all of these land use zoning and planning, and communities that are looking at economic development, and then checking with the water suppliers to see what is the ultimate impact of this type of development to a long-lasting water supply, and not just supplying to our homes, but also what is the impact of this development to our water resources in general, to water quality in the Jordan River, to levels of Great Salt Lake, to water quality in Utah Lake, to water quality in our canyon streams. In my opinion, we're starting to get to that point, or maybe we've gotten to that point earlier, but we're starting to realize better that the link between land use and water supply and water resources has got to be better defined, and there has to be more coordination. I'm sitting on a committee right now that's giving me a lot of hope, that has a number of elected officials and water resource experts really trying to dig into this issue and ask the question, where do the policies need to be put into place at the local, state, and state level here in Utah, or even at a federal level, but really local land use and state policies regarding land use. I think those are very, very important questions that we're going to need to dig into. So thank you for that question.
Anything from you, Mike, on that one, or Laura hit it all?
No, Laura nailed it.
Great. So transitioning over a little bit to, transportation. And I think Alan actually had a good question, but we'll get to that one in a moment. But, there's a number of conversations that kind of came, as you mentioned, came from Mountain Accord, talking about improving transportation in the Cottonwood Canyons. Kind of seems like we're looking at different flavors of gondola, and whether or not, that starts and ends in Little Cottonwood Canyon or ultimately connects over to Park City. Flavors of trains, whether they're on or off, the existing disturbed area or going up the creek. You have bus type solutions as well. What are your guys' thoughts on, modes, alignments, or even what we are doing? I mean, these projects seem designed to get more people into these watersheds, and obviously the mitigation is more development. So how do you balance the desire to go, enjoy a powder day with, thousands and thousands of your best friends, with managing our water resources and protecting against development?
So I think, Laura and I have talked about this a fair amount, but so I think we're kind of a similar mindset, but I think one of the concerns that we have is with, and I don't want to speak for you, Laura, so I'll just share my thoughts and then you can add whatever. But one of the concerns we have is a potential permanent solution that is really hard to back out of, mostly because we don't know what unintended consequences could come about with some of these more permanent solutions, bigger investments, if you will, bigger capital improvements as far as transportation options. So it almost makes better sense to look at something that can be scaled and reversed once the unintended consequences are better understood. Additional busing, other options other than something more permanent like a rail or even an aerial gondola. So it's a tough question, but again, it also ties back to the question of what is the capacity of these canyons? What is a reasonable visitor capacity allowance, if you will? So.
I agree with everything Mike said, and as he mentioned, we have been working pretty hard on this together, both with the UDOT Little Cottonwood Canyon EIS process, as well as the Central Wasatch Commission processes. And I think when I think about it too, I think about some of these options are kind of building a new corridor, a new high capacity transportation system alongside the road. And I think a lot of our stakeholders, when they think about a train or a gondola, they also think about, well, there's got to be some limitation to the vehicles on the road or just to vehicle use. But there's no management plan in place to actually do that. And I worry about building another system outside of the existing road corridor where we've just created this high capacity pipeline in another system, plus we have the road, and we don't really understand, what kind of behavioral changes or incentives would need to happen to actually get people out of their cars? Is there political will to do that? Can it legally be done? In talking to UDOT the other day, they're under the impression that they can't close the road because it was built with federal funds. And so some of this is just, I mean, some of this is, it really just hasn't been thought all the way through in terms of the capacity issue and what is our future desired condition of these canyons in terms of how many people and where they're going all at once. I have a concern that the infrastructure at the tops of the canyons wouldn't support some of this use either. And then the management capacity, as we've talked about before, you know, so there's a lot of talk about transportation solutions and everything, and I think it's a good conversation, and it's an important one. But there's a piece of that conversation that really needs to be brought to the forefront, and that is, what is our desired future condition? How many people do we really want, or can we fit into these canyon areas?
Great, thanks for that. I mean, when I think of a roadway and another high capacity mode, be it a rail or a gondola, I mean, that's what we have servicing the I-15 corridor. So it certainly seems it makes us nervous as well to think about that volume of capacity coming into these areas. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned policy. Do you think there are policy solutions? Have any of the policies from the federal legislation, do you think those are strong enough to mitigate the impacts as they currently stand?
The legislation, in my mind, does a couple of important things to mitigate the impact. One, it creates some certainty around the long-term protection of federal lands in the area, where you could get more pressure on those federal lands for more development, as you have more people in these high capacity systems. So that's one thing. I think the legislation also has, I think there's a management plan or a management committee that would be formed as part of that legislation too, that I think would be important. But the policies that I'm thinking about too have to do with just sort of operational and management policies. Like, is there a willingness to provide a toll at the mouth of the canyon, or you know, some kind of fee that both incentivizes people to take the transit solution, but also maybe puts more resources into managing the impacts of this additional use to the watershed. And, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking, you know, my budget for watershed management increases just about every year. And my budget is funded by our water ratepayers. We don't collect taxes. And so there's a fairness issue too of, you know, who's paying and who's benefiting with respect to how much management that this will take. And so I think there are a lot of different perspectives and ways to look at the issue, and a lot of different interests too. And so I think the conversation is just really important.
Yeah, I would add one technical element, who's paying and who benefits. Little Cottonwood Water Treatment Plant treats Little Cottonwood Creek water, as I noted earlier. That water has the ability, once it's treated, to just about make it to any part of the valley. So really, you're looking at more than 1 million people here in the Salt Lake Valley that benefit from safe and clean water, source water coming out of Little Cottonwood Canyon. So it's really important. It's important really for the entire valley. So that's one additional note that I would share.
Great, thank you. Oh yeah, go ahead, Roxanne.
I have a related question. What does success look like? Are we that unique, or is there someone we can copy either here or abroad that has solved this already?
That is a great question. And that's something that we've mentioned actually during these processes. Are there similar situations elsewhere? And I think you can take bits and pieces from different circumstances and different watersheds across the nation. And as you mentioned, abroad, every watershed is pretty unique. And I think there are some unique things about this, but I think there are a lot of management strategies that we could probably copy, or at least consider.
It just seems like that'd be the easiest place to start, you know?
Yeah, it's a good place.
Yeah. Do you know of any, have you explored any strategies, Mike, that you think might be cut and paste?
No, just what Laura has alluded to. There are other watersheds that have some practices that perhaps could be modeled and could be helpful. But again, as Laura has noted, each watershed is unique. And so there are certain things that potentially we could glean from practices and policies implemented elsewhere. But, and I think some of that is happening, but this is a very unique watershed as well. And so we have to make sure it is custom fit to the needs of what we have here, obviously.
I mean, and just off the top of my head, I know as it pertains to, protections of water, I mean, some watersheds don't allow human access at all. Some of them are like ours on the other end of the spectrum, it seems. Some watersheds have been designated national monuments to help protect the water resources. Others have sought local laws, ordinances, and congressional protections. So I think they run the gamut, right? And kind of on this, transitioning here to maybe things that we can do. Alan had a great question that he put in the chat here, and I'll just go ahead and read it, Alan. Because we've gotten this question as well from a few other folks. I think it's a different approach that might be something worth.
There are several places in the world that have made waterways of one sort or another into legal entities comparable to people. And I'm wondering if there's any effort to do the same with the Great Salt Lake, which would give it under Utah law some rights to, quote, beneficial use of water, which right at the moment the Great Salt Lake does not have. I'm just wondering if there's anything going on in that vein in Utah, and if so, if not, what can we do about it?
Personhood of our natural features.
Yeah.
Rivers, lakes, mountains, rocks, trees, plants, wildlife.
There's an interesting book about that actually, called "Should Trees Have Standing?" and it's a legal analysis with respect to what you're talking about, Lindy. But with respect to Great Salt Lake, there is some conversation about it's in the water rights arena actually, and what can be considered a beneficial use under water rights. And there is some conversation about water rights being able to be put to beneficial use for in-stream flows. And there's a little bit of that right now, but it's kind of limited and focused in how it can be used. Salt Lake City has been advocating for a few years that using water rights to support in-stream flows is pretty important. In part, that helps us with some of our water quality concerns in some of these streams as well, and some of the regulatory requirements and obligations because of water quality. But there's also a lot of other really good reasons too, with aquatic habitat, and just maybe taking a much more one water view of how we manage our water resources. Right now, it's kind of segmented into a lot of different areas, whether it's water rights or water quality or water resource management, and under different legal frameworks too. And so what you're suggesting, Alan, I think I kind of see the conversation in the water community starting to navigate there, but it's also maybe a little bit scary conversation too, because people want to understand what the unintended consequences are to their own water supply regime, which is understandable too.
Well, at least there are some examples of how it has worked in other places, and the consequences don't seem to have been catastrophic at the very least.
Yeah, and it would be nice to be proactive about it and not wait for a catastrophic consequence.
Yeah.
The other consideration with the Great Salt Lake Health is a Bear River supply into the Great Salt Lake. And as many of you may be aware, there is a Bear River development project relating to water supply into the Salt Lake Valley and other places along the Wasatch Front. So again, conservation is key in delaying such projects to help maintain the health of the Great Salt Lake, because that will be a huge impact as to the, relative to the health of the Great Salt Lake as well, if it's implemented.
That's exactly why I asked the question. I have a brother-in-law who's a geologist whose expertise is in water issues. He's worked a lot down in the Salton Sea. And I would hate to see the Great Salt Lake become the Utah analog of the Salton Sea.
I was just out at Antelope Island, and for 2/3 of the causeway, there's no water until you almost get there. And, another elephant in the room in terms of wetlands is the development of the inland port. Shouldn't happen. Just bad idea.
Before, I want to get one quick question in and respect the remainder of your evenings here. One more question, well, two more questions. One just to kind of close the evening out. But we had someone write in, why does the burden of conserving water always seem to fall on the individual? They definitely believe individuals need to use less water, but it seems like we're going to need unified systematic change in order to mitigate and persevere through climate change over potentially several generations. I guess with that kind of statement / question, what should we all be doing? What can we do to help protect these resources for ourselves, our communities, and the other natural wild values of that we share these places with?
Yeah, so it really is a collaborative effort, as is noted in that question and comment. But I think really outdoor watering is probably one of the best first places, low-hanging fruit areas to start as far as conservation efforts. And there are a lot of resources out there to help with better efficiency relative to outdoor watering. In fact, the Metropolitan Water District actually supports a Utah State University water audit program, which is a free program to residents of Salt Lake City and Sandy City, but also not just Salt Lake City, but customers of Salt Lake City Public Utilities can receive free water audits through that resource. And I can share that link if that'd be helpful for this group. But that is something that they come out and they'll actually do an analysis of your watering patterns and your approach to watering and your outdoor water usage and give recommendations to improve your efficiencies. So I think that's one of a good starting point. And it isn't just residences, it should be businesses and institutions and others as far as watering habits and outdoor water use.
Thanks. Do you have anything else to add, Laura?
I think Mike nailed this one, but I mean, conservation is definitely one of the key things that all of us could do. And it's, as Mike said, it's not just residents, it is the entire community, our businesses and institutions, and we all need to work together. One of the things that's important with respect to that commercial, industrial, and institutional sector is being able to analyze the data with respect to their water use. And that's something that we're working on right now with the adoption of our latest water conservation plan. That's a real focus for us, in addition to the residential use, but but also, you know, who can we start partnering with in that commercial, institutional, and industrial sector, whether it's outdoor use or process related water use. There's got to be some additional efficiencies as well, and I think it's everybody's responsibility.
Great, a truly shared resource with a lot of interdependencies. Well, I guess I just want to ask if there are one or two things that you could just reinforce, reiterate, or, you know, a huge aha thing that you could leave with folks. We will be posting this recording online for people to look at and things like that. So what's a big takeaway or something that we want to be action oriented? So leave us with some inspiration for the evening.
I'm not sure if this is inspirational or not, but I think one of the important things that I noted earlier is the canyon water supplies really impact the entire Salt Lake Valley. And so this is a bigger issue than just the communities right here next to the canyons. So I think it's really important that everyone is engaging in the public processes related to the development of these canyons, because there really is a vested interest for the, you know, all of the folks who live in the Salt Lake Valley. So I think getting involved with, you know, the Central Wasatch Commission efforts, getting involved with the UDOT, Little Cottonwood Canyon, EIS, NEPA process, just any of those opportunities for public involvement. I think it's a good thing to try to get involved and share input and perspective. And, you know, public input is really important in the process.
Great. Thank you, Mike.
I agree with Mike on that. The public involvement piece is critical, and it's really, it's not easy all the time. It takes a lot of time. Evening meetings, afternoon meetings when you can't get out of work. I mean, it's a big effort, but I think these canyons, I mean, we haven't had a water quality emergency that threatened our water supplies to the Salt Lake Valley in decades and decades. And that is because we have proactively managed these canyons so that we protect those water resources and in turn protect public health and the valley's prosperity. And I think sometimes, and I think this was mentioned earlier, if we don't have a shock in the system that all of a sudden wakes people up and say, oh, this is fragile, this is vulnerable, then we sort of forget it. It's sort of out of sight and out of mind. And I think as we're talking about the population of the Salt Lake Valley growing and the intense pressures for recreation use and development in our watersheds, we really need to stay aware and involved. There's a lot we can do to continue to protect these water resources for future generations. And in my presentation, that's one of the things I really wanted us to think about. We're not only protecting it for ourselves, but it's going to be very meaningful to my children and their children. And Carl, your cute little girls, and so you know, I just don't want us to forget sort of our place in time and history when it comes to these really critical watersheds.
Is there any future in like using gray water for, I mean, why are we flushing our toilets with potable water? Why are we watering? I know that's huge infrastructure, I'm sure, but is there any future for that kind of use?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question as well. It's a great question. And Laura could probably speak to that issue better than myself. But one of the challenges that translates to as well is allowing water to continue to flow to the Great Salt Lake for the health of the Great Salt Lake. So it's kind of that balance. How do we maintain the balance as far as the Great Salt Lake health and reuse and those types of concepts?
That's exactly what I was going to say. So
Well, I just can't thank you both enough. And this was one of our probably more popularly attended one of these. We had a lot more registrations than any of our other ones combined. So there's a lot of interest in water, and I think rightfully so, in the second driest state in the country. So thank you both. You're an inspiration, and we're lucky to have you. So oh, Alex, sorry, I forgot. We did have a raffle or a drawing, I guess. Did you have, was the person here or?
Yeah, the person is not here, but we
Okay.
should definitely thank Koala Tree is a local company that's been supporting Save Our Canyons, and they helped us out with doing a raffle to get people involved in this. So definitely thanks to Koala Tree, and look forward other ways like that for us to get involved with businesses around Salt Lake and Utah.
Cool. Well, thanks again. Thanks to Koala Tree, and thanks Mike and Laura. Yeah, can't thank you enough. It was really informative and helpful.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
Great to see you all.
Yep. We'll do it live one of these days in person too.
I can't wait.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Good night.
All right.